Uh, a very a very good evening to all of you, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to take an honor welcoming each one of you on behalf of the Pune International Center, India Development Foundation, Department of Economics, Mumbai University, and Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics to the annual conference on Pathways to Urban Future. This is a great event for all of us as we meet physically after a gap of 2 years. So let me introduce our chairperson of this inaugural session, Dr. Kelkar. Dr. Vijay Kelkar is one of India's preeminent economists. He is a former finance secretary and chairman of the 13th Finance Commission. For his service to the country, he was awarded the Padma Vibhushan, India's second highest civilian award in January 2011. So known as the architect of the GST, Dr. Kelkar was advisor to Minister of Finance. He was a finance secretary from 98-99, and in 1999 he was nominated as executive director of India, Bangladesh, Bhutan, and Sri Lanka on the board of International Monetary Fund. Currently, he is vice president of Pune International Center. Welcome, sir. Now let me introduce today's keynote speaker of this conference, Dr. Patricia Clarke Annez. Dr. Annez was a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institute of Stanford University. Previously, she served as the urban advisor in the Transport and Urban Development Department at the World Bank. With over 20 years of experience there, she has worked in operation and finance as well as in the Central Urban Unit, where she works on a strategy and project development and analysis uh, on the performance of the uh, urban project. She was a member of a core team of the World Development Report 1992 on development and the environment. She has worked as an economic and financial advisor for large US and Canadian corporations. Uh, she has published Financing Cities, Fiscal Responsibility and Urban Infrastructure in Brazil, China, India, South Africa, and Poland with George E. Peterson, and Lessons for the Urban Century, Decentralization Infrastructure Finance in the World Bank. Welcome, ma'am. Now, without further ado, I hand over to Dr. Kek. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Vishal. Patricia, on my behalf, let me welcome you once again for this lecture. I have not stand with you and our audience, so I invite you to give a lecture.
Good evening, all of you, and my thanks to Vijay Kelkar, Dr. Vijay Kelkar, to the Pune International Center, and the tireless organizers for inviting me and making all this happen. Many of you who have seen me speak know what I tend to talk about. So to avoid confusion, I will start by talking about what I'm not going to talk about. I'm not going to talk about how much India needs to build more and better urban infrastructure. This is now known and obvious, but far from resolved. It's even more important now that climate change demands more resilience. Without basic infrastructure of all kinds, plus robust secondary and tertiary systems, resilience is unachievable. Even rich countries with good infrastructure suffer with extreme climate events. See the deadly floods in Germany and Belgium last year. Pakistan's dramatic flooding this year has shown just how tragic climate change can be in poor places when infrastructure is not up to date. To invest, city needs money, and finances fall dramatically short in Indian cities. They are improving, but sometimes we wonder if they're keeping up or falling behind. I won't repeat the issues with fragmented responsibilities and hence complications and delays often involved in taking positive action in Indian cities. I won't go on about how desperately dear housing is in cities for the poor, the middle class, and even the rich. Putting a roof over one's head is a basic challenge for all city dwellers all over the world, but it is unduly expensive and precarious in Indian cities. It could and should be so much better. Nor will I go into the details of the restrictive, opaque, and unresponsive regulatory frameworks for urban land and the punitive sanctions for infractions. All this stunts private and public investment and creates bottlenecks that are costly to many. Complementary to the undue land use regulation is the dysfunctional and opaque property rights system. It works primarily for those who are well informed and have the deep pockets to make files move. So it drives inequality in cities, even when regulations are liberalized. When reform comes and it's actually implemented, it's the lucky few who access the system and avail of the opportunities, while those who live in informality and see their uneasy compromises, irregularity put in danger. It can be costly. Small wonder that many oppose it. The focus of my talk is also not about something we all know, but which should remain front and center as we look at urban strategy in India. That is all the amazing energy, resilience, and value, economic and social, that is created in Indian cities. We should never lose sight of this. Migrants, permanent and temporary, come to the city and make their way. It is very tough, but they better themselves and their families, or they would stop coming. How resilient and hardworking those migrants are. And so many of the poor and lower classes struggling with them to make way in the cities. The images of armies of migrants leaving the cities during the pandemic were both heartrending and an incredible monument to the bravery and endurance of the poor in India. The situation was terrible. The people facing it with such courage, truly admirable. I recall when visiting Dharavi in the day, I used to see young women walking in the streets in lovely light pastel summer saris. I could never figure out how they tied those saris in their small arms, how they looked to be untouched by the mud when they walked. I marveled at how lovely they looked, and I admired their determination not to be undone by those tough living conditions. Despite all the regulations and constraints that world banks and others complain of so very, very often, many good things happen in Indian cities. The urban economy is growing fast and generating innovations every day, even if that growth isn't measured well yet. It isn't anywhere, really. So much good is happening in Indian cities, it simply cannot be ignored. They should not be seen as a chaotic, unseemly blemish on Indian society, a necessary evil. They should be seen as promise and opportunity, but they could be so much better. I applaud the Pune International Center and Dr. Clarke and all of you present at this conference for your ambition to make this improvement reality. I wish you all very productive deliberations and follow-up work thereafter. To open this conference, I want to pull back and talk to you about something else, about developments in another city, another place. That city, shown in this lovely 19th century painting, is Ghent in the Flemish part of Belgium. It's a tiny place in a tiny country. It's a place that has problems, sometimes creates them, sometimes must endure ones that come from the outside. Of course, in spite of those, it has wonderful qualities. It's a place I've been watching for the past 50 plus years. It is one that was pretty gritty when I first got to know it. It's not a paradise now either, but considerably more livable. Definitely making some mistakes, but also definitely doing things. It's a chameleon city with a lot of capacity for change. And for this reason, it offers inspiration and ideas. This is not to say, however, that talking about Ghent means that Indian cities should emulate it. But I felt their experiences might give some ideas about how to make things happen, not in the drawing board or in the committee room or an investment cost estimate, but on the ground or in the water, as in the case of Ghent. Up front, you might ask, what does Ghent, Belgium have to do with Indian cities? If we look at the per capita income figures here, you can see that Belgium is far richer than India. India's income per capita today is close to that of Belgium in 1900, after a century of industrialization. But all is not encompassed in that one statistic. The hero in Ghent is a local entrepreneur who defied England. In the early 19th century, he arranged for industrial spies to go to steal the technology for the spinning jenny. That was a crime punishable by death in England at the time. He succeeded, and in 1800, Ghent established its first industrial textile mills. They were the first on the continent of Europe. Just as Ahmedabad was the Manchester of India, Ghent was called the Manchester of Europe. And industry brought plenty of pollution. Maybe a bit more familiar to the Delhiites in the room. This picture dates from the 40s or 50s, most probably. Later on, I'll show you what the area looks like today. As we put the income per capita figures in context, I would draw your attention to the growth figures. After very low growth under colonization in recent years, India's growth surpasses anything Belgium saw in the 20th century. There are caveats to these comparisons, of course. Catch-up growth in India, the terrible effects of years of colonization in India and prolonged oppression on the European continent, and wars, of course. This being said, India is catching up rapidly. It will feel the same growing pains and rewards that mid-century Ghent had to pretend with. Another common feature with India, Flanders is a very densely inhabited part of the world. And this was and remains a challenge for all sorts of reasons. While Belgian cities don't have the densities of their Indian counterparts, congestion and spatial organization is a problem that does not go away with high income. By the way, Ghent is in Flanders. It's hard not to remark how pitiful growth was in India during the colonial period. Some of you may know that Belgium was a colonizer in the 19th century, but Belgium only became independent in 1830. For most of its history, it was ruled by various other large powers who were often attracted by the riches that Belgium and Ghent in particular had to offer. And the locals didn't care for this any more than did the colonized India. There we go. In the 16th century, there was a tax rebellion in Ghent, and the Habsburg king, Charles V, who was born there, executed several prominent citizens. He made those who survived parade through the city in their nightshirts, barefoot, with a noose around their neck, just to remind them who was in charge. Every year, this event is commemorated with pride. The Ghent people are very happy to be seen as independent-minded and rebellious. What's more, as the English technology theft shows, they feel dumb rules are meant to be broken if they can get away with it. Jugaar is a well-known phenomenon in Ghent to this day. Just get it done. Being ruled by others and getting the better of them can ultimately become a strength, I believe. Encroachments, we can do that too. People are creative about the rules in a variety of ways. I know this is the famous castle of Ghent, or it's famous around here. It was prison workhouse for a while. It was the stronghold of the nobility in the day. But the French Revolution got the castle out of the grips of them, and now it was fair game to do what they wanted. Now, of course, it's a tourist attraction. This is a place called Tipperary, which is in the local dialect, Tipperary. It's a place in Ghent. With a little bit of humor, they named it Petit Paris. As in India today, the benefits of growth were not very equally spread in Ghent. Well into the 20th century, this picture was taken after the war in the 60s or 70s. Slums jostled just next to nicer neighborhoods. In the early 50s, in this neighborhood, one latrine and a water pump served 50 people or more. And it was located in the heart of a fairly prosperous neighborhood. Look at how nice. And there, where the arrow is, you can see the nice bourgeois neighborhood around and how you get into this. So over the years, Ghent placed plenty of problems akin to those in Indian cities. I'd like to turn now to discussing some of the most important features that have been drivers of change. First one is that they have a love affair with infrastructure. Ghent has been trying to dominate nature for a long time. Rivers are the most important geographical feature in the city. It sits at the confluence of two of them, the Escaut and the Lys, both navigable year-round, both tied ultimately to the Rhine River system. They were probably the principal economic reason for being of the city. Already in the Middle Ages, they were trying to bend these rivers to their will in Ghent. This canal was first dug in the 11th century. It joins two rivers directly and was very useful for both defense and economic purposes. The river walls over most of the city were stabilized in the Middle Ages to ease river navigation. It was essential to the economy, but a big project. But as the city changed, the areas surrounding these canals changed with it. This is now pictures. That was the late 20th century. And that's it today. It's in a tourism and recreation area and is no longer the warehousing and trade center that it started as. These two rivers running right through the center of town have meant the construction of around 200 bridges to ease pedestrian and vehicle traffic. Most were built to turn 90 degrees on their foundations to let river barges pass through the center of the city. This created nightmares with urban mobility that became a real burden in the post-World War II period as motorization took hold. Ground traffic was blocked when boats needed to pass, and many school child had an excuse for saying they were late for school. So, starting in 1950, a huge project created a ring canal with fewer but higher bridges, as you can see here. This detoured freight boats around the city center. It opened 19 years after the beginning start, and it left the picturesque rivers and canals in the center, but without the freight barges. The Periphery Canal was a huge, unwieldy project, custom made for the needs of Ghent, but benefiting from considerable central support. Of course, don't ask what the negotiations with the Waterways Authority and the city of Ghent are like. Waterways is an institution reporting to the Flanders regional government, the equivalent of an Indian state, and controls most of this infrastructure, bridges, adjoining roads, and waterways running throughout the city and the greater metro region. And of course, they're essential to the economy and quality of life. You can guess pretty well how easy those negotiations are. My second similarity is that economic considerations have been an important part of Ghent's identity. They've driven change in infrastructure investments. Political autonomy evaded Belgium until 1830. And even after independence, the borders weren't easy to defend. In World War I and II, they were invaded in a few days and occupied for years. At one time or another, most great European powers dominated Belgium and ran the show. The Habsburgs, France, Burgundy, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Holland are among the many. Economic dynamism was the best option to assure a modicum of welfare and bargaining power and thrive, even if it also meant foreign powers wanted to come and control you and exploit you, of course. Economic autonomy was gained early. It was one of the first free cities in medieval times, and it was second only to Paris in size during the late Middle Ages. Because economic considerations were so paramount, they pushed infrastructure and investment and drove fundamental changes. This is the port. It was right in the center of the city until well into the 20th century. This is the 19th century. Later in the 20th century, it moved a couple of kilometers out as boats got larger and trade volumes grew. Then, in the beginning of the 21st century, it moves even further to benefit from the Ring Canal and provide more room for industry and make the channels even deeper to allow mega vessels for bulk transport. Port now goes out to the North Sea with many factories located, including ArcelorMittal, one of the biggest of their factories in Europe. So, just as in the Middle Ages, it's a driver of the economy today. The port has the distinctive advantage of providing connectivity by inland waterways and rail in addition to truck traffic. Volvo has its largest production site in Europe in the Ghent port. And China, now the owner of Volvo, is investing in rail connections to bring production to and from China via rail. The port has fused with the Dutch port. They're not the best friends, but it's a good idea from an economic point of view because they stay competitive that way. But it still has Ghent still has a big share ownership in it, and it involves a lot of jobs and plenty of money for finance. This is what happened to the historic port in the first trial. It's now part of the touristic center, of course. And this is what's happening to the post-war port, about 2 kilometers out. It's become a new area for, on the right, you have a school, that's an apartment building. It's a whole new part of the city that's come up in the last 10 years. So they've moved a long way from the textile mills and the encroachment on the castle. As the port evolves, so too does the infrastructure supporting it. An example is this bridge. Which of these bridges is older? Many people say it's the one on the right, but it's the bridge on the left. When the Ring Canal was built, the industrial area in the city center that used this bridge shifted elsewhere. That bridge, you see the one on the left, rotates. It has a pedestal underneath, and it can flip onto that and let a boat pass. But the industry center left, and so they rebuilt the bridge so that the new one is on the right. It was situated next to the historic center, and they made an old-fashioned fake old bridge suited to the quaint-looking neighborhood better. This is what that area looks like today. To make all these changes and adaptations happen, the finances of the city are tied to the economy. All cities in Belgium are allowed to add a percentage to the federal income tax, and it is collected by the city, and it's remitted automatically to the cities. The regions can do the same thing. Likewise, cities get a share of the VAT in their territory. So there's a virtuous circle linking good economic development and revenues to keep providing quality services. Another feature of Ghent that I find very distinctive but helpful is common sense often wins over principles. The textile production exploded in the 19th century before motorized transport. Workers had to live in walking distance from factories in awful conditions. They were settlements with crowded tiny houses and minimal services. They were built by the factory owners like Charles, or else wealthy families that were down on their luck after the French Revolution converted their palaces into living areas. The officials of the city hated them. They often complained about the lack of adherence to building and aesthetic standards. But it was hard to resist even factory owners who wanted their workforce near at hand. To this day, even with much higher incomes, pragmatism rather than form drives standards. There are many houses in Ghent that would not meet formal Indian building standards. But as long as they meet sanitary and safety standards, they're okay here. They can be bought and sold freely with fully enforceable mortgage and property rights. They never fear punitive demolition, nor do they need the goodwill of politicians or administrators to be regularized. This tiny house is well located, and it sold last year very quickly. after it was put on the market. Now I'm back to the Charles, or the cités. Even up to the 1970s, many of these houses had no running water connections and primitive sanitation, only a common pump and outdoor latrines. But as living standards improved, these neighborhoods underwent tremendous change. Some of these cités were torn down, but many others have been repurposed. This transformation was partially made possible by a group in the town planning section of the university who documented the economic and social life of these cités to establish a fact basis to replace typical preconceptions. Some city officials, for example, declared that these cités were inhabited mostly by foreign guest workers anyway, so no need to worry too much. But the studies showed that the majority were elderly, poor local people. Changed the calculus. Studies also demonstrated that properly refurbished, not raised, these neighborhoods play a role in an evolving city. As industry moved out and the center became more service-based, these tiny houses, duly upgraded with modern amenities, provided well-located, low-cost housing for seniors, new households, and students. This is the same neighborhood, redone. Note all the bikes. And the students picnic out there in the summertime. The university currently has 70,000 students, which is more than a quarter of the population of the city. It became an economic powerhouse as accessibility to all socioeconomic categories became more important after World War II. Housing for students was more of a consideration, and these centrally located houses fit the bill well, and they could be converted without being destroyed and without necessarily displacement. Some changes take more time. I have no pictures to illustrate the following change because it is primarily olfactory, not visual. A dramatic change in Ghent since the 1970s has been modern sanitation for all its water courses and the improvements in water quality that it served. The rivers were used from the Middle Ages to modern times as runoff for industry. The Lys River was called the Golden River, not because it shone brightly, but because its chemical composition was ideal for rotting linen. And that was a profitable industry. Flemish linen was exported all over Europe and brought them lots of gold. But runoff from upstream linen production gave rise to very pungent smells of rotting organic matter, also a kind of amazing pink color. It went all through the city, right into the 80s. That pollution combined with untreated human waste runoff, and it made the smell unforgettable. And these water courses ran all over the city, including the most expensive neighborhoods in the historic center. Regular upgrading of trunk infrastructure took place primarily in the 19th century in the aftermath of the cholera epidemics, much as Haussmann did in 19th century Paris. The roads were also raised to prevent chronic flooding. Modern sewage treatment facilities awaited the 1980s and 90s when one of the mayors introduced revenue handles like paid street parking and dedicated them to this expensive upgrade. Of course, as in almost all cases I know, including the United States, central government systems paid the lion's share of the cost of installing proper segregation of water treatment. Public pressure and shame lent support and helped make it happen. Now, of course, this clean water brings amenity and economic value. This is the same neighborhood as all the smokestacks. It's changed a lot. But that's an old warehouse on the right. A fourth feature I think of as typical and laudable. Ghent is good at reversing mistakes. They've been at the forefront of many economic and social developments. The modern textile industry was born in Ghent. Flemish labor union followed, union movement followed a while later. Today, it's the European capital of vegetarianism and veganism. It's less exciting in India. But being at the forefront doesn't come without cost. The latest fashion doesn't always look good a few decades later. The car became king in the city in the 1960s and 70s. Parking lots were placed wherever there was room, and the rivers were seen as a pragmatic solution. So waterways were covered to build parking lots. These are the same parking lot. Very pretty area of the city, but awful. Here's another case in another part of the city, beautiful part again. This is clearly in a historic center near the cathedral and so forth. This was a huge project just to make room for cars. This involved tons and tons of sand to fill in that river. Fortunately, after some years, most of these parking lots on waterways were demolished and underground garages were. It was just as big a project, probably bigger and more difficult, to open up a filled river as it was to fill it up. But open it they did when the amenity value of the river became more important and cars less so. This is first parking lot, and this is second. These are now beautiful parts of the city. A fifth feature that is admirable again is avoiding mistakes, both centrally sponsored schemes and others. While they happily made mistakes that looked like mistakes in retrospect, fixed them, they also avoided irreversible damage. This beautiful Art Nouveau concert hall was saved from becoming a parking tower, thanks in large part to a master's student in architecture. When he learned that the hall was slated for demolition for a parking lot in the 1960s, for his thesis, he made a photographic documentation of its unique architectural features and illustrious history as a socialist meeting house and concert hall, the Palace of the People. Fortunately, once people and administrators realized what might happen, the permit to destroy it and build a parking lot was withdrawn. It is now a very active cultural center. It has a great bar and restaurant at democratic prices following their socialist history, and it sits in the heart of the student district. This beautiful medieval building was destined in the 1960s to be torn down because of the university. They wanted to build modern student dormitories. It was temporarily saved by someone who leased it and used it for paid parking. The image of Clarke parked in this architectural masterpiece with a long history shamed the city and the university into finding a different use. It has become the university restaurant now, and it is a conference center. The university pays for the upkeep, and it is also open to the public. Can't you just see a dormitory there? One of the most famous mistakes avoided came in the early 1970s. The centrally sponsored scheme took the form of an underground metro plan for this city of waterways. After sponsoring metros in a few other cities of Belgium, the center decided it was against. So but not everyone agreed that this represented a project. This is where they were going to put it, and this is what it was going to look like. Not everyone agreed this represented progress. Besides destroying beautiful parts of the city that was just awakening to tourism, many thought that the vibrations would have been disastrous in a city with so many ancient monuments and such a high water table and porous soils. And many simply thought the sacrifice wasn't really needed for a city of 300,000 people. The general public responded in mass. All over the city, in windows of homes, restaurants, and shops. There were posters against the metro, as in this one in the picture. Name means no in French. Various groups were formed and funded to stop this transformative project. The idea eventually died after so much protest, and probably with the help of the weak economy in the mid 1970s. Meanwhile, civil society was strengthened by the success of their efforts to reject an outside solution that made no sense to them. The riverfront in the historic center is now a beehive of kayakers, pleasure yachts, paddleboarders, restaurant boats, tourist boats, solar powered cocktail barges, and no metro. The battle for the city continues, by the way. There's always someone to benefit from and promote a controversial idea. This is the castle today, and these are some new plans. The jury is still out on this one, in spite of widespread protests. Fingers are crossed. I won't pretend to be objective. The last point I want to talk about, to me, boils down the essence of Ghent, is in its culture and history, is how they handle differences. Differences of view are not seen as a fundamental problem in the local culture. They're recognized as inevitable. Since the Middle Ages, different economic and social groups have vied for power and influence again. The nobility versus the powerful monasteries versus the merchants versus the craftsmen versus the unskilled laborers, all of them against the former rulers. Later on, entrepreneurs versus workers, socialists versus Christian unions, the church versus any unions, Catholic factory owners versus freethinker libertarian owners, the French speaking bourgeoisie versus Flemish nationalists. These are a few of the many divisions that characterize the densely packed, economically interdependent society of the city. The wars of the revolution, the wars of religion, French Revolution, and the Napoleonic Wars following it, not to mention 2 German occupations, were painful reminders of how costly it is to stop negotiating and pick up arms. So the dominant view is one of pragmatism, one that says work it out and make a deal with something for all sides. Most of all, don't pretend there's one right answer that will work best for everyone. That just impedes constructive change. Rather, recognize differences and ensure that there are ample opportunities for forums for airing changes and finding compromise. It takes humility. Think of all those guys that backed off on big projects. And it takes patience, but it brings progress and helps people identify with their city. Now, all of this is specific to a little country on the other side of the world from India. These experiences should not be interpreted, please, as providing best practice. I'm out of that business. But perhaps Ghent's messy path of progress can inspire ideas for Indian cities, provide a stimulus to look at how the elements that made things happen so often and so richly in this place might be unleashed and recombined in India's cities. My goal in talking about Ghent is not to trace an ideal trajectory, but instead to underscore the rewards of moving forward despite all the challenges, mistakes, and setbacks that entails. What you see in the recent photos is a beautiful, historic, and charming European city. It was recently written up in the Washington Post and the Guardian, God save us. It's the kind of place you might visit and say, nice, but out of reach for a poor country like ours. What I hope to demonstrate with the older photos is that the city in the not so distant was grungy, messy, smelly, and in many neighborhoods, a nasty place to live. But with sustained economic growth, revenue streams tied to that growth, strong identity, and rabble rousers, including technocrat researchers who would mobilize popular movements, this city reinvented itself pretty regularly and became a better place. Not a perfect place, but a better one. Their willingness to try out new ideas, risk making mistakes and fixing old ones, tinkering, building, and resisting created momentum for change. Ghent is relevant to India not because structural characteristics line up tidily. No, it is relevant because India too has all this energy and creativity. And now it has rapid growth. The rest can happen in a uniquely Indian way. And I congratulate you all for putting your ingenuity to the service of that admirable goal. Thank you.
Patricia, can you hear me?
Yes, now I hear you.
First, let me thank you for giving a spectacular start to our conference here. There may be some questions. Will you take some questions from my colleagues or comments? Hello? Patricia?
Yes, I'd be happy to take questions, of course, and comments.
Who wants to start?
Thank you, Patricia. This is Rakesh. How fantastic to hear you after. Yeah, can we see her? Uh, what can you do?
Oh, you can't see me. I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
Isha?
Switch on your camera.
Yeah, you have to stop sharing. Oh, well, you see,
Aha.
I'm seeing my.
Now why?
Just
Ah,
And hi there.
there you are. There you are. So nice to see you, Patricia, after so many years, and
It's
giving
lovely
such a
to see you. Oh, right. Yes, my goodness, how nice.
fascinating talk. I was all set for a boring thing on urbanizations, urban structure, etc. What is just what the doctor ordered after after COVID.
Well, you're waiting for dinner.
So one thing and that's part of the boredom that you could have inflicted on us, but I think I do have to ask a question that you described a whole succession of really transformational changes over centuries, decades, and years. But we don't get a sense of how that happened. Who were the shakers and movers? Were they architects? Were they the city governments? Were they private sector players? Because that's really to get this kind of a huge change. So, I mean, for example, the massive change going on in central Delhi, as you would know, in New Delhi, is totally being done by the central government. Whatever you view may be on the desirability of that change, nonetheless, huge changes taking place. It's totally dominated by central government.
Ah.
Ideas haven't come either from civil society, the private sector, and so on, nor architects. Architects have done a post facto in the sense that once it was decided by the government, therefore architects have to go into action. So I think it's very important to get a sense of what process business such change can take place on sort of a continuous basis for 200 years.
Okay, my answer to that is you mentioned a whole list of stakeholders, and it's all of the above. There's a very strong identity here. So everybody feels like they have a stake in this. And everybody, again, because there was, I mean, the history created a kind of equalizing factor by being controlled by outsiders. And so everybody who was from there was in it together. And so this culture came up of everybody being involved. Now, for example, I mentioned several cases where the university did studies, but there were, there were many people that took initiatives, just private rabble rousers. For example, I know a well-to-do doctor that financed a lot of that opposition to the metro. He just thought it was a bad idea, and he cared about his city. And there's this feeling of ownership. again, because outsiders control the city, the culture feels very much this should be ours, not theirs. And so often you have private sector entrepreneurs who want things done a certain way. Certainly, the private sector entrepreneurs that insisted on resisting the city when they wanted to impose standards. They just wouldn't let them have it. And the standards were unrealistic. Thank goodness they didn't. But you had outside forces. You had history. The French Revolution came. It broke the power of the church, and private individuals, private entrepreneurs became much more important. And the cadastre came into hand. So everything was put in the cadastre, and it was more important to register it than to formalize it. And once it was in the register, it could be bought and sold. I mean, there's a variety of features like that, but really everyone feels an ownership in the city. And the center comes and sends stuff down, and the city decides whether they like those ideas or not, various citizen groups. And that continues up until this day. There's just a tremendous diversity of people that, for example, these plans to build the addition to the castle, they were gonna put a gift. They still want to. They want to put a gift shop. And the center, not the center, the state equivalent is proposing subsidies. But the subsidies say you can't have any participation in the design of the project. Well, that just caused an enormous problem. As soon as it got known about, all kinds of groups started forming and creating protests. There was a plan that plan is probably going to go forward, to put a supermarket in an old church, because they don't use churches anymore, so they have to somebody has to maintain them, and people figure they take up so much space, you got to put them to some good use. There's a restaurant just down the way from me that's for low income people and regular people to go at a modest price. It's in an old church. Well, they want to put a supermarket in the old church. Well, a lot of people thought a supermarket was too much. And so so this musician just sat on the steps every day, playing his violin, collecting money. And a lot of people joined him. So it's a sense of ownership that means a lot of different people got involved, and identity that did that. And so, as I say, there was this fellow that stole the technology. It was from a rich family. Obviously, income makes a difference. But right now, there's a huge protest going on about taking away an area of land that's grown up wild and green in one of the worst neighborhoods in the city. One of the furthest out and lowest income neighborhoods. And they basically said, we're not having it. And they keep going. There's these institutions you can go to. There's a special Supreme Court where you can go and complain and bring citizens complaints. So it's a welter of institutional frameworks that are there for settling differences, combined with a sense of ownership of the city amongst all groups. And people are very proud to say you're a Hinton. That's just the way things are.
Thank you. In continuation with the same question, I wanted to know who can be credited with this taking up this participative process, and who did the reconciliation of the differing perceptions and opinions and priorities?
That's done with they have a legal framework that makes it very easy to kind of set up a common interest group, a nonprofit common interest group. And so people tend to do that, and then they go to the city hall and they say, we're not having it. For example, this castle project that's going on now, and the metro project earlier, they were proposed, and then various groups were formed spontaneously. people that were well-to-do, people that know how to make the levers of power work. For example, a friend of mine is the old ombudswoman of the city, and so she knows every part of the city from having worked with them time and again. Well, she helps various groups form and protest things that they don't like that are happening in their neighborhoods. And they just go to the city and say, you have to talk to us. She's also, by the way, in a group that has been created. This has been created by the central government, I believe, to mediate the complaints of victims of child abuse by priests, which is a big deal here. But they want to try to avoid, well, they want to create reconciliation as they possibly can. So they recruit people with experience such as she has in mediation and so forth to work with the victims and the perpetrators. And the legal system handles that completely apart. It's not, they don't compete with one another. So it's, yeah, it's flexible and it grows up organically. Short answer.
Thanks. But I think for me it raises even more complicated questions. And I think what you described really is a journey of transformation has so many scales and so many layers to it. On one hand, there are economic transformations which are happening. There are planning, architectural transformations which are happening. There are transformations which are linked to the use of a resource at a particular point in time, the transition from a industrial economy to perhaps a more service-based economy. And all the while then equating this to the value of participation, the value of making decisions at a local level through multiple conflicting processes, but which are also reconciled. And somehow, to me, at least in Indian cities, currently at least, there are multiple debates and multiple changes which are happening simultaneously, and also multi-scalar changes as well. And from that point of view, I'm going to ask just two questions. One is, what is the cost of making mistakes and reversing them? Pays for those costs? Can the city afford these costs? And are there points of no return when it comes to these costs? The second is a related question, and which is, you spoke of some mistakes which were reversible and some transformations which were reversible. But you also spoke of changes and avoiding irreversible damages and mistakes. Now, who makes the distinction between what is reversible and what is not reversible? When we think about so many kinds of changes which are happening in Indian cities, at one level, for example, just think of mobility and the thing of every Indian city having a public transport system. And for having a public transport system, you negate and you drive away paratransit systems, which are in some ways de facto public transit systems in multiple Indian cities. Or the new notion of bringing in a metro. There are several groups which are opposing this. There are several groups which are suggesting multiple options to this. Okay? And yet, kind of changes which seem to be actually then making their way head on is a clash of interests, not just at the city level. You're not able to influence decisions because these are decisions made at a state level, at a national level, and with also international agencies influencing these decisions. So, I mean, therefore, I'm not convinced with some of the responses that you gave to what are the transformative triggers. And I would like some reflections on that.
Well, uh, in response to your question about what's irreversible and what's not, there's a lot of irreversible damage. I didn't emphasize that because there have been mistakes. Uh, I think the point is to say just because a mistake is made does not mean that all of them have to. That we simply say the system is rotten, it won't work. Because I think what this showed was that as people grew in awareness and they were willing to organize, it became more possible to organize. Then, and believe me, a lot of people died getting the union movement going. But once it was there, and once it was well anchored, it couldn't be avoided anymore. So it's not that this happened, that suddenly someone had this great plan for all these wonderful frameworks that would be created and so forth. It was messy and it moved forward messily. Um, but I think the point that I would focus on is this feeling of ownership. We may have been hard done by many, many times, but we have to pick this up and own it ourselves. We can't avoid owning it and doing what we can to organize. And so we may make some mistakes and irreversible costs, but some have been avoided. People should take inspiration from them. And I've seen it here. People talk about it all the time. They're so proud of the mistakes that were avoided. They're so proud of the culture. And there's a big city feast every year that goes on for 2 weeks. And besides partying and drinking beer and all that stuff, there's all kinds of lectures and presentations about how the city was, how, guided tours around your neighborhood to know every nook and cranny of it. People want to own this place, and that is a good thing. Now, to your point about big frameworks, if you think that international institutions are a mess, try the European Union. They have all kinds of things to tell people. The state, province, or no, it's not the province, it's the region, has all kinds of things to tell people. But they've constantly come back here and said, no, we're not having it. Or, okay, we'll go along with it because we're going to get some money from that project and we can maybe do something good with it. But there aren't conditions that can be just created out of a framework that will make all these things happen. What I was trying to say is that it is messy and organic, but it can happen. And some of the features of how it happens is people take up the banner and they fight for it with the things that they can fight for. This department in the university that was there was set up to study slums. This master's student who wanted to save the city. The mayor who decided it was time to have sanitation. So rather than begging the center for money, he created a revenue source and then he went to the center and said, you have to do something about this. So that's all I can answer to that. I hope it helps a bit.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Hello. Hello. Hello, ma'am. If we have a waterways in the cities, why does the state government not have policies to make most of the use of these resources rather than the making the transformation that was advisories on environment? Because while we urbanize more, we also have to look and aim for environment challenges as this is irreversible effect that we could experience.
I'm sorry, I'm having difficulty hearing the last part. You may be too close to the mic.
Hello, hello,
Yes?
I'm audible. Because while we urbanize more, we also have to look and aim for environment challenges as this is irreversible effect that we could experience.
Well, all I can say is that irreversible effects don't mean that the whole city is destroyed. There are going to be mistakes. and they can't all be reversed. But it's worth looking at whether, for example, first parking lot I showed you was built over the water. Second parking lot I showed you was built by filling in the water. Well, the first one could be undone much more quickly. And people, decided after about 25 years, enough of this, and we're going to do something else. And they got rid of it. The other one took a lot more building of consensus around this mistake, uh, because it was going to be a lot more costly and they had to bring a lot more people on side. But eventually, for example, the car is being replaced by the bicycle now. But that's been very gradual. There's been various stages of that. And now it's reached critical mass that they could go and they could get money and say, we need to build our water courses. We've become a recreational, a touristic center. And so they could mobilize money for that. But it didn't happen. It didn't happen overnight. It had to be gradual. As for irreversibility, here in this place with historic buildings, the most important thing is to think before you demolish. Building dumb stuff is one thing. Demolishing things to build dumb stuff is quite another. And so, that's the simple rule of thumb. But I'll give you another example. There was a governor of the central bank that came from Ghent. And he thought it would be a really good idea for the gold, local economic development. This was bringing home the bacon, well, not bacon in India, but whatever, bringing home the goodies into the local town. So they built under the square, under the Gothic cathedral, the gold reserves of the central bank of Belgium. Well, about 20 years in, they figured out that towers were cracking under the weight. They found out in time and they got it out of there. And then they had to do a lot of renovation work on the cathedral. I think it took about 7 or 8 years that they had that under scaffolding. But at least they stopped it before the damage went too far. Now, you could say, it was a mistake. It could be reversed eventually. But you have to be aware, you have to be transparent. People got to know about this and they cared too much about that cathedral. And the cathedral is the most visited monument in the city, I think. So they paid attention to it. So another point that I think is important to recognize is the effects of wars and external subjugation, is that a lot of destruction was wrought by invading armies. During the 17th century, there was a lot of destruction wrought by the Protestant Revolution. There was a bunch of iconoclasts, much like the iconoclastic movement among radical Muslims, and they knocked all the images out of the cathedral. That was, there's churches with heads lopped off all over the city. They eventually got past those people. They rebuilt the images. But they recognize that you have to rebuild sometimes. So don't give up on rebuilding. Don't give up on repairing. Think before you resign yourself to just living with problems.
Thank you. Patricia, last comment. Subhashish?
Can't hear you, Shubhashish.
Can you hear me now? Yes, I can
Yes,
hear myself
thank you.
now. Yes. So, Patricia, you talked about 300,000 people, right?
Yeah.
So how much does that play a role? Because it's easier in a 300,000 population city for somebody to know what is going on in the city. Whereas if you talk about Delhi or even Gurgaon, right, with now more than 2 million people, it's difficult for people to know what is happening in different parts of the city. And given the fact that our cities are really not run by anybody in the city, right, is there any suggestion you have to sort of go through the same experiences that your city went through?
Yeah, I mean, I think they build it up from the building blocks, essentially. I mean, you can think of building blocks that are the size of Ghent in a place like Gurgaon, probably. I won't even say for Delhi, but uh, it's the question of scale is enormous. That's true, and the fact that it's a smaller town as people come to know things. But there's more transparency also. I think transparency plays a huge role. I think also stronger locally elected government. I don't want to be the one to take on the IA officers running cities, but here the mayor is elected and he's the most important. I mean, he's the person people that has to answer when people are ticked off. They go to the city hall and they, you know, they leave garbage on the front steps or they make all kinds of protestations at city hall, and the mayor has to answer for it. And so, a strongly elected government, um, and then revenue in the hands of that government in that area makes gives them power, and then transparency. Now, I have to say that I don't think it was always so transparent, but people have just demanded more and more transparency over time. Maybe that comes with high incomes, maybe that comes with more education. Uh, but there's no doubt that the scale is smaller, but the elements could be implemented at a smaller scale in India and then built up from there because the whole country of Belgium is half of Delhi. Um, but that doesn't mean, I mean, in Belgium, everybody says it's so complicated because it's at such a small scale. But nobody would ever want to undo all that complexity. They just wouldn't have it.
Well, in any case, whatever you said was very hopeful in the sense that if a city could go through these transformations, without major bloodshed, I think it's very hopeful. And our cities are changing. The possibility that we can tell the same story sometime later.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more about the hope. And Ghent has always given me hope because I've watched it change so much, but India has to, definitely. It's
Patricia,
changing faster than perhaps people on the inside are recognizing.
Patricia,
Hope.
now I think we have to conclude because time is up and I know you have other commitments. I was just thinking, Patricia, absolutely outstanding lecture. You covered all the sessions of this conference. Transforming urban government, financing of cities, urban shared spaces, and building resilience. So each one of the sessions, I think you have provided extremely important pointers of what we should probably think about and talk about. The second point you made reminded me similar insight I learned from one of my mentors and Lavraj Kumar, and he always used to tell me that Vijay and openness, more knowledge leads to better policies. So the point which you're making about transparency, discussion, openness is the key for doing probably something similar in India. So once again, on behalf of myself and all my colleagues, I want to give you much sincere thanks for taking so much valuable your time, and I know, despite your other challenges, you did find time to speak to us, and I'm most grateful to you for extreme graciousness and kindness you gave to us. So please join me to give hearty.
Can I just thank you for inviting me? And it's been such a pleasure to see so many familiar faces and see some new ones. That makes me nostalgic for India, and I hope that's a problem I can fix soon. I wanted to also make an offer to everybody in the room. Some of you may know that I brought a Lodi Garden Pie Dog to Ghent when we moved here 10 years back. And he taught me how to know this city. He helped me discover much of it. So I'm offering any of you who come to visit a Delhi Pie Dog walking tour of the city with cocktail. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Department of Economics, Pune, Mumbai University. I would like to thank our chairperson and keynote speaker to delivering such a wonderful address. And on this note, that I announce that we have concluded this inaugural session. After this one, that mocktails are served over here, and 8 o'clock that dinner will be served. Thank you. Just one small announcement. Tomorrow at 9:30, the registration will start, and 10 sharp that we will start with the first session. Thank you.